Hello everybody and welcome to the Drydock episode 385. Once again, as this is a catch-up month, we have questions taken from guides 453 and 454 on HMS Basilisk and ARA Uruguay, the Wednesday videos on 1942, the decisive year of World War II with John Partial, and HMS Ventura versus U-864, along with the Friday videos on the Cylander affair, why Britain tried to seize Swedish destroyers, and the Cards online mobile game. BK Zhong asks, did anyone consider how vulnerable paddle wheels would be to enemy fire before building paddle-wheel-driven warships? Yes, and it was actually a matter of much debate during the consideration for how early steam-powered warships should be propelled, and concerns over the potential destruction of paddle wheels and thus the immobility of ships, and to a certain extent also the amount of broadside guns that would be obscured by having to have paddle wheels on a warship, was actually why you don't see any major paddle wheel warships. All the paddle wheel warships that were built were smaller stuff, usually unrated ships, a few paddle frigates, but there were no paddle-powered ships of the line, for example, even though from a water-tightness perspective and a modification perspective, it would theoretically actually have been easier to do paddle-powered ships of the line as opposed to screw-powered ships of the line. But at the same time, you also have the fact that when it actually came to combat, it turned out that paddle wheels were a lot stronger and more resilient than people had given them credit for. Because yes, you could shoot holes in the floats, that's the individual paddle blades, and you could even destroy them in some cases, but having a few holes in a few floats, or even having one or two of them knocked out, didn't massively actually affect the capability of the paddle wheel as a whole, and the floats were pretty easy to patch up or replace. Even the sort of the spindle setup that actually connects those to the central driving axis was pretty simple and easy to fix as well if a bit of that got damaged. Really, the only bit of the paddle wheel that was properly vulnerable and could really stuff up your ability to move was the main drive shaft, and that's a pretty small target. Now, of course, unlike a screw propeller, it is exposed, but as far as I'm aware, no significant paddle warship ever actually took a hit there. Probably just due to the statistics of it being extremely unlikely to happen in the first place. But one of the bigger concerns, which was borne out, was the fact that, obviously, because of the location of the drive shaft, the engines, or at least part of the drive system, had to be above the waterline. Now, initially, there wasn't anything you could do about that, just due to the shape and size of the initial steam engines and the ships they were in. But it very, very quickly became very desirable to have your engines below the waterline, so that any shot that did make it through the hull was very unlikely to, cause catastrophic failure in your machinery. And for that, obviously, running on screw propulsion with screw propellers was much better than a paddle wheel, which, as I said, you by necessity have to have at least some of the machinery above the waterline. And that, as much as anything else, was what meant that you very quickly saw paddles die out as a propulsion system, even on small warships, although they did stay around for things like harbour tugs for quite a lot longer. Redosaurus asks, since the tribal class destroyers were well thought of by the Royal Navy and their crews, why did the Royal Navy choose to make other classes of destroyers rather than making more tribals with whatever refinements they needed? That actually came fairly close to coming to pass, because the gap between the tribals and the previous generations of destroyers in the Royal Navy was so stark that in the immediate aftermath of them being ordered, there was actually a lot of discussion which assumed that future destroyers would actually be in two separate types, like the French torpilleurs and contre-torpilleurs, where you'd have the tribals, which would be the start of the big class, if you like, and they would be succeeded by some kind of super tribal, and then the smaller destroyers in the sort of 1400-ish ton range would be a parallel development. However, at the time, there was still, technically speaking, the Second London Naval Treaty to take into account with its limits on numbers and types of destroyers, and also the fact that tribals were quite large and therefore quite expensive, and finally the fact that the tribals in and of themselves, although they had exceptional performance for surface engagements, they only had one set of torpedo tubes, which caused some concern amongst the elements of the Royal Navy who saw torpedo attacks by destroyers as being a key part of the fleet. And between all of this and obviously cost issues, they decided that what they were going to do was they were going to try and improve the fighting power of the regular destroyers, the smaller ones. And if that necessitated a slight size increase, then so be it. And then there was this whole discussion of, well, do we go with kind of a miniature tribal that's entirely or very heavily gun-based, even more than a tribal is proportionally, and then a very weakly gun-armed companion on the same hull, but that's stocked heavily up with torpedo launchers. And fortunately, that idea died a death as well. And then what you end up with is the J-class, which incorporates some elements taken from the tribal class design, like the twin 4.7s instead of single 4.7s, but they obviously have two sets of torpedo launchers, essentially adding a second set of torpedo launchers in the exchange for one of the aft gun mountings, and the whole thing's on a smaller hull. But then they start to consider other things like more anti-aircraft protection, so they're starting to look at pom-poms and the .668 Vickers heavy machine gun, which doesn't go anywhere, but they're thinking about it at the time. And they're also starting to consider speed, because one of the tenets of the Royal Navy when it came to torpedo attack on enemy ships was that a destroyer should have a 10-knot margin of speed on the capital ship that it was attacking. Now, when most navies still have ships that are doing sort of 21, 22, 23 knots, then a ship that's doing 33, 35 knots is fine. But when the new fast battleships are coming out everywhere that are able to do 27, 28, and some maybe even faster than that knots, well, now a 5-6 knot speed advantage maybe doesn't seem to be quite good enough. So they start looking at a really fast ship, basically something similar to the French Mogadors, which is obviously going to be very big. And Admiral Henderson at the time is also pointing out that the small cruiser, like the Dido class, and the large destroyer are kind of merging, a bit like what the Italians would do with the Capitani Romanis. And he kind of points back to his Design V, which had been the sort of the parent of both the Didos and the Tribals. And he actually argues for, again, this kind of intermediate ship, which would have 3 twin mounts like the J-class did, but they would be twin 5.25-inch mounts with a pair of torpedo launchers. So you'd be looking at a 2,700 to 3,200 ton ship that was a very large, either a very, very large, very heavily armed destroyer or a very small anti-aircraft cruiser, but and obviously in his terms, kind of a hybrid of the two. But the time and expense that would be taken in building them, and therefore how few you could actually get, because by the time they've got to this stage, they're thinking, yeah, war is coming pretty darn soon. They decide, okay, maybe that's a step too far right now, given the situation we're in. And then that leads them to develop the L class and subsequent, basically the last generations of pre-war Royal Navy destroyers, which essentially take a modified version of the tribal class hull. And like you can see here, this is Milne and M class, with 3 twin 4.7-inch mounts, somewhat better for anti-aircraft usage, and then the 2 sets of torpedo launchers, other light AA guns, and essentially the Ls and the Ms are a slightly more rebalanced tribal in some respects. And also the tribal and L&M hull would be used as kind of the basis for a lot of the wartime emergency flotilla ships as well. So the super tribal almost happened, but a combination of initial jitters around the dying embers of the Second London Naval Treaty combined with the larger issues around cost and time of construction meant that it got kiboshed. Brendan Buersdorf asks, I've heard it discussed in some ship designs before, but what exactly is a uniflow steam engine? It even equipped several escort carriers. Is this a type of triple expansion engine, or does it work off of a different principle? There's probably an entire video explaining how a vertical triple expansion steam engine works compared to a uniflow engine. In fact, there's several videos in just looking at how vertical triple expansion engine works, especially considering now I've been on the John W. Brown, and I can tell you all about how that engine room works. But nonetheless, the short version is that in some ways a uniflow steam engine is similar to a vertical triple expansion engine in that they both use expanding steam in a cylinder to push a piston. However, the exact mechanics of how are quite different, and that is obviously what sets them apart. So in a vertical triple expansion steam engine, or a triple expansion steam engine generally, or, well, any kind of reciprocating steam engine really, what happens is you have your piston connected to a driving rod in the cylinder, and then you admit steam at one end, the end where the piston head is, and obviously that steam expands and that pushes the piston head down. And then once it gets to the other end, that steam has expanded and lost a bunch of energy. You then admit steam into the other end, which pushes the piston head back, and what was the input now becomes the exhaust or output for the steam, and that's governed by separate mechanisms connected to the engine, which move valves around and everything. And then so you get the movement in reverse. Now steam is pushing the piston back up, and then you're back where you started, and obviously now the lower input becomes the output or exhaust, and back and forth they go. Now, this is the kind of the standard, but there are some limitations and issues with it, particularly around things like thermal efficiency, because while we're still talking about steam coming out still being quite hot, it's a lot cooler than the steam was when it went in. And so what you end up with is, because the input and the output is the same physical structure, you end up with obviously hot steam coming in, but that steam is then having to expend some of its energy in reheating its own input channel and the top of the, if we're starting at the top of the cylinder and piston head, and that energy is therefore wasted before expansion can then push the piston head down. And obviously every time that steam cycle happens, there is a little bit of lost energy. Now, what a uniflow engine tries to do to avoid that is you still have your steam inputs at either end, but instead of having the either end also being the exhaust, you have a separate third exhaust which is in the middle, and so you tend to have a much bigger cylinder head, and which is just under half the length of the cylinder. And then steam comes in, pushes the piston down, if we're starting again at the top, and then as you run to the piston, the top of the piston head reaching just past the midpoint, obviously you uncover the exhaust, the steam is exhausted, a little bit of steam is left over in the cylinder by the time the steam coming in from the bottom now starts pushing up, or if it's horizontal, left and right, whatever, you get the idea. But critically, there's not cool steam exhausting out of the input. It's only exhausting out of the separate exhaust. Now the piston head starts coming back, and a little bit of that hot steam that's still left in the cylinder, now it's compressed. Obviously, the temperature goes up because that's what happens when things are compressed. And then as the piston head moves back to its original starting point, obviously steam exhausts out of the exhaust again, the steam from the lower input. And that highly compressed trace of steam at the top, in the top part of the cylinder, has now essentially or reheated the top of the cylinder, so that when fresh steam comes in for the next cycle, it's not losing much of, or if any, energy to the surrounding environment, and therefore you get more use out of the energy in each burst of steam. So in that respect, a uniflow engine can be more efficient than a vertical triple expansion steam engine, but there's a whole slew of advantages and disadvantages to both sides, like the fact the uniflow engine has to run somewhat faster, so you might have to consider gearing and flywheels for balancing because of the way it works and all sorts of stuff like that. But that's the essential key difference. It's how the steam is input and output of the cylinder. Imprison Grover Fur, for whatever reason, asks, Drachinifel, how viable was it for Hitler to escape by submarine to Francoist Spain or Japan in April 1945, a course of action that some of his underlings advised he take? It would certainly be possible to try. You had a few people escaping Berlin even down to the last few days of the war. So theoretically, maybe using a Stork or something like that, one of those Stoll aircraft that the Germans were quite good with, he could have made it to one of the few remaining German ports that had U-boats there. But there are a couple of things. Firstly, going to Francoist Spain, I think, would have been a bad idea because Franco was fairly pragmatic in some respects. And yeah, if Hitler rocks up in Spain in April 45, just as Nazi Germany is about to be crushed under the boot heels of the Allies, Franco is exceptionally unlikely to give him sanctuary. Even if he wanted to, he would recognize very quickly that this is not the kind of thing that's going to be able to be hidden, and he doesn't want the Allies coming after him next, so he would probably turn around and say, hey, Allies, guess who I've got as a house guest? Anyone want to come and pick him up? Japan might be a bit more viable. Obviously, they have no interest in handing anyone over to the Allies, but there is a slightly larger problem, and that is whether or not the U-boat would actually make it. Because in 1945, the Germans lost about half of all operational U-boats, roughly speaking. Depending on exactly how you count operational U-boat and so forth, it can be between 40 and 60%. But roughly speaking, there was a 1 in 2 chance of an operational U-boat sailing out and just not coming back in 1945. And that is with a whole bunch of fresh U-boats being commissioned in 1945. If you looked at the number of U-boats by name, or number, I guess, that were operational in December 1944 and compared that to those exact same ones, which ones survived through to May 1945, the situation is somewhat bleaker. And the casualty rate of submarines undertaking the really long voyages is even worse still, the ones that tried to get to or from Japan, in part because, well, the Allies leveraged their intel advantage considerably more so against those specific subs as they compared to what they did against the more general U-boat offensive. And that was in part because, well, planning for that kind of voyage generally involved a lot more communications going on, and you can bet, if it's, we are taking Der Fuhrer to Japan, that's going to involve at least some degree of communication to tell everyone what's going on. And yeah, if the Allies through ultra intel go, hey, hang on a minute, Hitler's trying to flee Germany in a U-boat, you can bet a good chunk of the US and Royal Navies are going to be gunning for that particular sub. Ironblood Enjoyer asks, I once saw a piece of art that showed USS Ranger CV4 in Argentinian service as 25 de Mayo. If Argentina had the funds to do so and the US was willing to agree to it, would the US have sold USS Ranger to Argentina? In very broad terms, in some kind of alternate timeline, the general US principle of sell semi-obsolete weapons systems, including ships, to South American countries to try and prevent them from going communist, would apply to USS Ranger. I mean, she's not an Essex class. She's nowhere near an Essex class. She's not even Enterprise. And Enterprise, of course, being a Yorktown, was very quickly put into the reserves. But although in theory you could potentially conceive of an alternate timeline where this happens, I don't think the US is going to throw any kind of massive fit of, oh no, we're letting a strategic asset go. Yeah, they'd quite happily move Ranger on if it got them more money than it did scrapping her. But more realistically, in our timeline, it was never going to happen in part because Ranger was considered so obsolete by the end of the war. She went very quickly from frontline service to reserves to being scrapped in the space of a couple of years. She was gone by the end of 1947. So you only have a kind of a year and a half-ish window in which sale could be concluded. Maybe a little bit longer if Argentina puts in an expression of interest in early 47 and they hold on to Ranger for a bit rather than scrapping her immediately. But it's a very, very narrow gap that you'd have where Argentina could be in a position to buy the ship and the US could be in a position where it could let it go, because they're not going to let her go during World War II. But during that exact period, that's the period where the Peronist government in Argentina is at its least popular with the United States. I mean, the US ambassador literally went out and gave speeches in Spanish telling the Argentine populace why they shouldn't vote for Perón around this time period. That's how antagonistic things were. So, yeah, in the 46, 47, 48 period, there is absolutely no way the US government is selling Perón anything. In fact, at that point, they're trying to actually not sell things to him and actively stop him from selling things to other people. Of course, they changed their tune very quickly in the early 50s once they realized that, well, if the Western capitalist political bloc decides that they want to punish South American governments for not fully agreeing with them, there's this other big communist bloc rising that will happily trade with them. And that's when you see things like USS Phoenix being sold off to Argentina instead. But by that point, Ranger has long since been reduced to scrap. Corky asks, I've seen a few sources claim the Town class were fitted in preparation for receiving twin 8-inch gun turrets as a possible wartime refit if necessary. Is there any truth to that claim? And if they had been rearmed, how would they have compared with contemporary heavy cruisers of other nations, or even the Royal Navy's own heavy cruisers? That would be news to me. The Town class, as far as I'm aware, and as far as any of the sources I have immediately to hand say, were definitely not Mogami style, oh yeah, we put 666s on here, but honestly we can switch them out to twin 8s whenever we want. Apart from anything else, if you look at the size and dimensions of the twin 8-inch that existed at the time, i.e. the County and York and Exeter class turret, and look at how that would fit, well, actually not fit, in the spaces allocated to the somewhat more compact 666s on the Towns, it's just not viable. So yeah, I don't think that the Towns were ever really fitted for that kind of light cruiser to heavy cruiser swap out. However, what some of the sources might have gotten a little confused by, potentially, is some of the very late war, well, not very late war, but very late interwar period and very early war studies on what they could potentially do to restart heavy cruiser production. Because during most of the period, the British really didn't want people to build more heavy cruisers. We're talking about the mid to late 1930s. They'd do almost anything they could to avoid it. But when it became clear that war was coming and no one really was following the treaties, then they were like, oh, okay, we might as well take a look. And this is where you get some of the initial studies for 9.2-inch ships. So what you end up doing is, first you see a move towards, okay, if people are just going to not regard the treaties, why don't we have some 9.2-inch cruisers to fight heavy cruisers? That they very quickly snowballs into, what if we have 9.2-inch armed super cruisers, kind of almost Alaska scale ships, 20,000 ton plus. But then that's also very briefly brought back to, well, what if we build 10,000 ton-ish heavy cruisers with 8-inch guns, perhaps, and maybe that will serve us well without, escalating things. And in that very, very brief window when they're thinking that, they do sketch up some designs, but by that point, they're pretty much almost all about 8-inch turrets. So here you can see I've kind of mocked up vaguely what a 1940s-ish Town-Fiji derivative hull, i.e. a Town class hull, the 10,000 ton hull, with some more Fiji-like features, because that's the latest light cruiser design, but with 3 888-inch. That's obviously not precisely this layout, but something like this would be what they were actually looking at in that very brief window. There was a very, very even shorter look at should we have twin 8s instead of 888s, because obviously it would require slightly less work, considering the existing ships already had 4 barbettes planned in. But they decided, no. Very quickly, they wanted the triple eights, hence this SketchUp. But that entire, should we build a 10,000 ton 8-inch ship period, that just kind of, that lasted maybe a month, if that, because then people just said, well, hang on a minute, if we're either about to be at war or then we are at war, and nobody's following the treaties anyway, why bother limiting ourselves to 10,000 tons? And then you start to see ships considerably above 10,000 tons again, not quite Alaska-style supercruisers, but well above 10,000 tons, a few of which consider 8-inch guns, but they actually very quickly go back into looking at 9.2s. That's really about the only time when they're seriously considering the whole thing. Now, could you, in theory, have adapted a Belfast-style hull to fit twin 8-inch guns? Yeah, you probably could have done, relatively speaking, easily. You'd need a new twin 8-inch turret design, but that's not really what the Royal Navy was looking for at the time. And as I say, the sketch design that they came up with was kind of a hybrid of essentially a Belfast-style hull with triple 8-inch guns, but with Fiji-like features for the superstructure and funnels. K2 North America asks, at about 33 minutes into the 1942 video, John notes that anti-submarine warfare is not the best use of destroyers, which should be used supporting the fleet. What then should be your anti-submarine warfare and convoy units? So it depends exactly on when in World War II you're looking at, but certainly by 1942, the ideal answer is going to be something along the lines of a River-class frigate. Obviously, before that, when you're in the early throes of the war, then something like a corvette. But in the later stages of the war, you'd obviously have evolved versions of the frigate and the US destroyer escort starting to arrive in numbers, which obviously initially had also derived from the River class, if a little bit quicker. But essentially, the frigate was originally spec'd to offer the same kind of capabilities as the sloop, things like the Black Swan class, but being much quicker and easier to build in a wartime environment. So really, if you really want to go back to even pre-war, your absolute ideal anti-submarine and convoy unit is the sloop, because it's got plenty of armament, it's relatively cheap to build, and it's definitely not going to get confused for a fleet destroyer. However, the sloop is kind of your peacetime perfect plan, whereas, as I said, the River class, the frigate dash, in US terms, destroyer escort, this is the cheap and cheerful version. Because what's it got? It's got the speed enough to chase down U-boats on the surface. It's got plenty of anti-submarine armament. It's got a reasonably balanced surface armament. Obviously, it can't really deal with big surface raiders, but the surface armament's more than enough to deal with surface submarines, defend itself on the convoy against aircraft, and being cheap and quick to build, you can have large numbers of them, and it's got a good range. Now, as time goes on and submarines become faster and faster on the surface, then obviously you do need something a bit quicker. But certainly for the start of the war and the mid part of the war, something like a frigate or destroyer escort is perfectly fine. One of the reasons you really don't want to use destroyers is, one, obviously they're a lot bigger and more expensive, a lot harder to build, comparatively speaking, and the fleet needs as much support as it can get. But also some of the stuff that goes into designing destroyers is not as ideal for anti-submarine warfare effort. So obviously for an anti-submarine ship, it can afford to go a bit slower, but you really need it to be quite agile with a lot of deck space, especially aft, dedicated for depth charges and so forth, and then later on hedgehog launchers up front. Whereas destroyers, they have to have very heavy torpedo armament, plus anti-aircraft armament, plus a surface battery, all of that can also be partially dual purpose. They have to be configured optimally for speed, and therefore not maybe quite so much for agility, and therefore they're not quite as good anti-submarine platforms as a dedicated one would be. Although, when it comes to fleet anti-submarine work, until you get the advent of what you might call the fast frigate or the last stages of destroyer escort, you either have to accept that your anti-submarine escort is going to be with you only when you're at cruising speed, and then you're going to leave it behind, or you use your destroyers for anti-sub work within the fleet and solely for the fleet, because, well, the destroyers need to be there anyway, so they might as well do the anti-sub work as well, which then allows you to free up your more specialist ships to purely work with slower formations like convoys. Indoraptor 8A45 asks, in the First World War you have the story of Olympic ramming a U-boat, but it seems somewhat weird to me, as requisitioned ocean liners like Olympic are used to carry troops from North America to the UK, which make them valuable ships, and so her action to ram a U-boat would not only cause a huge loss of life, but could also cause the ship itself to sink if the action went wrong. Were there any rules or orders issued to captains that would discourage this kind of action? No, if anything, it was the other way round. Merchant captains were actually encouraged to ram U-boats if it was possible to do so. Simply because, you've got to bear in mind, for the majority of the First World War, there was no effective countermeasure to a submarine underwater. Yes, you had depth charges and so forth towards the very end, but that was towards the very end. So, outside of really esoteric stuff like dragging trawl nets and fishing up U-boats like giant fish, you were basically restricted to hope the U-boat is on the surface and you can shoot at it with guns. But of course, most merchant ships didn't have guns, and even ships like Olympic had limited guns with limited accuracy. And if the U-boat was quite close, those guns might not even be able to depress far enough. So at that point, you're fairly defenseless, and you probably are not going to have an escort, and even very important ship like a troop ship might only have a handful of escorts, and if the U-boat's that close, then the escorts were clearly out of position, or the U-boat was very sneaky, or both. And so you only really have one weapon left to you, which is the ship itself, because, well, even at that close range, a U-boat can fire a torpedo at you and sink you, and even if you're really, really close, most U-boat captains, if they're confronted with a big valuable target, might well take the risk of potential some shock damage to them in exchange for severely damaging or destroying something like the Olympic, at which point, under the general principle of better him than me, ram them. Because, yes, in theory, ramming the U-boat will damage your ship somewhat, but you look at, well, even a merchant ship that's several thousand, maybe low tens of thousands of tons, let alone an ocean liner like Olympic that's several tens of thousands of tons, versus a U-boat that's only a couple of hundred tons, there is only going to be one winner in that confrontation, and it ain't going to be the submarine. And yes, there will be some damage, but it's the size disparity alone means that there's not going to be a huge amount of damage to the ship, in this case Olympic, relative to the sub. So it's more than worth it at that point to eliminate the threat. And I mean, to give you some idea of the approximate weight disparity here, imagine you're driving a mid-size to maybe large-size SUV with your family in it, and some lunatic appears, pops up in the next lane near you on an e-bike, one of these electrically assisted bicycles, waving a gun at you. Yes, in theory, if you ram them and crush them with your vehicle may sustain damage. But it's probably not going to total your vehicle. In fact, it's extremely unlikely to total your vehicle. It's probably going to be just cosmetic. And B, given the circumstances at that time, are you really going to hesitate? Probably not. It's just going to be squish time. And that's basically what happens when a U-boat confronts an ocean liner. Imprisoned Grover Fur asks, how do you respond to tanky talking points like the USSR doing all the work because 80% of German personnel casualties were on the Eastern Front? Is it entirely politically motivated negationism, or is it partially also a lack of understanding that navies and air forces simply have much lower personnel requirements, but much higher resource requirements, than armies, and or a case of forgetting that Germany wasn't the only Axis power? Or perhaps a case of amateurs studying tactics and looking only at the front line and the casualties while ignoring the logistics? I mean, my usual approach when I come across people who are so catastrophically misinformed, but also extremely aggressive about them not being misinformed, because they've got one or two graphs or tables to point to for very specific contexts, is just to roll my eyes and walk very quickly in the opposite direction. But without getting into, obviously, land campaigns, which I'm nowhere near an expert on, or politics, which I'm also not an expert on and I hate, I think my general response would be, yeah, study logistics, scrub, because, and also look at what the Soviets themselves said at the time, because yes, there's plenty of post-war propaganda, and both in the communist period and in the post-communist period in Russia. But if you look at what's actually being said at the time, in terms of both what Stalin is demanding and in terms of what the other Russian service personnel are saying, yes, there's a colossal land campaign with an awful lot of people getting killed on both sides on the Eastern Front. But the logistical support that's being sent to Russia, or the Soviet Union, I suppose, at that point, in terms of aircraft, tanks, trucks, equipment, machine tools, trains, basic supplies like even like fuel and so forth, all of this stuff that's being sent by the Arctic route, by the Middle Eastern route, and via the Siberian route, that is all critical to the Soviet war effort. And the Soviets are always saying, we need more, we want more, and also, thanks very much, we absolutely needed that to keep us in the fight. Because, yeah, it's like, the Soviets produced most of their tanks, but can you produce T-34s if you don't have, for example, the trucks to bring the components to the T-34 factory? Will you have the components in the first place if you don't have the trains to move the raw materials from the mines and so forth to the smelting plants? And yes, you can theoretically redo some Soviet industry to supply you with all of those things, but every factory that's making trucks and trains and carriages and all sorts of things like that to get the materials to build the tanks, well, those factories are not building the tanks, so you have fewer tanks, and therefore you might lose battles that you otherwise would win. And ultimately, you know, the Germans were fighting the Soviet Union from 1941 through to 1945 on land. The Allies were only fighting, if you like, the main German forces on land after D-Day. Admittedly, they were fighting German formations in Italy before that and in North Africa even before that, but in terms of direct confrontation with a huge chunk of the German military, that's 1944 and forward, so obviously physically less time to inflict casualties. While at the same time, you know, also fighting the Japanese and the Italians, and I suspect that if you add up all the Japanese and Italian casualties between Operation Barbarossa and the end of the war, and add them to, if you like, the very crude and honestly a bit distasteful Allied kill count, and compare that to the Russian kill count of Axis troops, you'll probably end up with some rather surprising results. Commandant Galileo asks, regarding the Battlecruiser 1919 design mentioned in the Origins of the HMS Hood video, what exactly is it? I couldn't seem to find anything online, so I got a little bit curious. Well, I'm still trying to decipher that myself. You see, I, like you know, look at most sources, and there's very little to any mention of what British capital ship design is doing in the aftermath of the Admirals and before they start the sequence that leads to the G3s and N3s ultimately, but you know, I call them the alphabet capital ship series for shorthand. Now, some sources will mention a bit of detail about a few designs and bits of design work that are being done in the very late 1910s, but it's still very sparse. And the only reason I know anything more about that is because I came across a misfiled document when I was doing one of my Q archive visits. If I remember correctly, it was actually while I was looking up Battle of Narvik documents, and I got a Admiralty file that included a whole bunch of different things, you know, logs and so forth. It's either, and I've checked the timeline of the PDF I created because I went to the archive on 2 separate days looking for 2 separate sets of documents, and then the day after the second visit when I got back I tabulated them all into PDFs, the various scans I'd taken. So it's either the Narvik visit or the visit when I was looking up all the Royal Navy, well, some of the interwar Royal Navy fleet exercises. But in one of those 2 visits, I opened the box, got a bunch of documents out because this box contained multiple different documents, all related to what I'd asked about, but also included this notebook. And I thought, oh, this is part of it, so I guess I'll start scanning it. And then when I looked through, I realised actually this had nothing to do with the contents of the rest of that box. And it's kind of a snapshot, if you like, of capital ship development, because it's not a ship's cover. So it's not saying, this was our specification and then we designed it this way and here's all the various bits and pieces. What it is essentially a series of bits of correspondence and notes on the development and testing of things like the hull models, which indicates it's a relatively advanced set of designs, and discussion about, what kind of bow shape should they have, and stern shape and fuel economy and all sorts of. I've still got to tabulate the thing because I keep going through it. I've got to transcribe it, I think, to be honest, because a lot of the stuff in it that's typed up is typed up in what I'm presuming at some point was black or blue typewriter ink, but has gradually faded to a very pale purple lilac colour that's very difficult to decipher. I basically have to hand transcribe it because OCR software can't tell enough of a difference, or at least the OCR software that I have. But what this notebook is talking about is actually two designs, Battlecruiser 1919 and Battleship 1920. And so obviously this notebook has to come from a very narrow window of 1920 forwards, but before they start looking at the L3s, M3s, etc., etc. And it's talking about both Battlecruiser and Battleship designs, I say 1919, 1920. So it clearly indicates that there's obviously a lot of work has been done before this thing has been tabulated for them to get to this point, as described at the start of the book, notebook. And obviously they don't get very much further than this because it's not that much longer thereafter that they start going into the alphabet capital ship series. So yeah, at some point when I've got some more free time on my hand, I need to complete my transcription of the contents of that book or notepad or notebook, whatever you want to call it. And then I might be able to offer a little bit more insight into what exactly they're going on about. And maybe follow up and see if there's other stuff somewhere in archives. But of course, the fact that this particular thing was essentially misplaced or misfiled means that there's a potential that anything else referring to these designs might also equally be misfiled and therefore almost impossible to come across in a dedicated search. Vicky asks a series of questions, so I'm going to try and answer them in a quickfire format, mentioning each question just before each answer. 1. Why did the twin 100mm mounts on the Akazukis weigh more than the twin 127s on the Fubukis through Yugamos, despite the fact they're lighter guns? Mostly the fact that the training and elevation requirements for a true dual-purpose weapon add considerable weight, both in terms of the strength of the mountings and the degree in which, obviously, they can elevate, which means that a dual-purpose or anti-aircraft gun mount is inevitably going to weigh considerably more than its single-purpose surface action mount. And that's a consideration with Royal Navy ships, for example. The weight of a 4.7-inch gun with considerable elevation for AA purposes is a lot more, once you take the mounting into account, than the surface action 4.7. So with the Akazukis, considering that they are quick-moving, very high elevation, rapid-fire weapons, even though the Fubuki's 127s are theoretically to a degree dual-purpose, they're nowhere near as capable as the Akazuki's 100mm, but that comes with a big weight penalty to make them that capable. Next is, of the grand total of 4 naval battles in history between full fleets of armoured ocean-going surface capital ships, try saying that 3 times, you've already covered 3, Lissa, Tsushima and Jutland, in full videos or series thereof. Are there any plans to cover the last remaining member of that set, the Battle of the Yellow Sea in 1904? Well, there's Yalu River as well, technically, but Yellow Sea as part of the Russo-Japanese War, yes, that will be covered at some point. I need to basically do a little Russo-Japanese War at Sea mini-series covering all the naval action that isn't the Voyage of the Second Pacific Squadron. So that includes things like the attack on Port Arthur and so forth. But with other things like Yalu River, it's a case of working out what the heck actually happened there first. Next, we have, did Crossroads Operation Crossroads test Baker actually sink Nagato. She was already leaking badly and would have quickly foundered anyway once she and her pumps were abandoned. Given the considerable time between when she was nuked and when she finally sank, could said sinking have simply been the result of severe said pre-existing leakage being left uncontrolled for several days while she was too radioactive for anyone to board her and turn the pumps back on? I'm pretty sure the actual test probably exacerbated those leaks, but when you look at a number of ships, including obviously Nagato and Prince Eugen, as well as a few others, a lot of them take time to founder because the leaks that have been caused would not in and of themselves necessarily be fatal to the ships if they were in fully operational condition, but because they are insanely radioactive at that point, no one can get on board to do the kind of damage control that would bring those leaks back under control. And I think the supposition that they took from that is that, well, the radiation from the explosion, assuming the shockwave didn't kill most of the crew, the radiation from the explosion probably would kill most of the crew, or at least incapacitate them in pretty short order, at which point any existing damage that, even in the terms of small leaks, would kind of spread out of control in the way that it did when it was just too dangerous to put people on board in the first place. And because, of course, it would still then be dangerous, very dangerous, to put people on board a ship, even if there were already crew on board who were incapacitated or dying from radiation. And finally, how were the Independence class? So it's still related to the Japanese, because how were they able to make do without a heavy anti-aircraft battery, especially during the kamikaze era later in the war? Wouldn't this render them vulnerable to being jumped by Japanese bombers, who'd be able to form up relatively untroubled just outside of 40 mil range before attacking, whenever the ship doesn't have a combat air patrol up? Well, the US Navy really didn't actually expect them to last that long. They were anticipating a lot more losses than they actually took. And of course, Princeton was pretty much a case example of exactly what happens in the kind of circumstance you describe. But the rest of the Independence class ships basically got away with it with a combination of a few things. One, having a combat air patrol up as much as possible. Two, sticking close to the bigger carriers, who could have even more aircraft up and could operate in even fouler weather. And as well as the advent of night-capable fighters, which could deal with night attacks and, to a degree, certain amounts of foul weather. Of course, foul weather, after a certain point, conceals you as much as it conceals the enemy and prevents you from launching further fighters. And of course, they, by sticking close to the big fleet carriers, also benefited from the massive amount of escorts that were around. So even if they couldn't directly defend themselves with 5-inch 38s, they were in the middle of a bunch of other ships which definitely could defend the fleet in general with 5-inch 38s. And so any Japanese bombers that were or kamikazes lining up to have a go at the Independences would have to fight their way through a screen of 5-inch 38 fire anyway. It just wouldn't be coming from those particular light fleet carriers. And then when they get close, obviously, the Independences have their short and medium range anti-aircraft battery to do point defense. A.B. Coates asks, how close can a ship's draft get to be the level of the seafloor, or the depth of the sea, without risking running aground? And what methods would ships in the period the channel covers do to safely navigate uncomfortably shallow waters? It depends somewhat on the ship, the conditions of the water that it's in, and a few other factors, but those first two are probably the most important. So when it comes to the water that it's in, for example, here is HMS Milne heading towards Clydebank shipyards. Now, as you can probably tell, she's in a river, and here the water is very calm. So in these circumstances, your ship's draft could be very, very, very close to the bottom of, in this case, the river, or if you had somehow this level of calmness at sea, the seabed, within a foot or so, and you would theoretically, based purely on that, be absolutely fine. However, the minute you start to get waves involved, obviously the ship is pitching up and down, and because of inertia, it's going to be pitching up and down slightly more than the amplitude of the waves. So if, for example, you have a draft of, say, 20 feet, and you have a wave height of 5 feet, Well, being in 26-foot water isn't going to help you, because when your ship plunges down into the bottom of a 5-foot deep wave trough, it's going to carry on a little bit more than 5 feet and you're going to hit the ground or the seabed or whatever. And of course, the rougher the seas, the more depth you need. The other factor we mentioned, which is quite important, is what type of ship you're in. If you are in a sailing vessel, then you can get a lot closer to the seabed than you can in a steam-powered vessel like this one, because steam-powered vessels, or basically anything that's running off of engines, they need to take in water for cooling purposes, not for the boilers, hopefully. And if you are too close to the seabed, even if theoretically you might be, a foot or two above the seabed, those intakes are probably going to ingest seaweed and silt and all sorts of other nasty things and clog up, and then your engine plant is going to die pretty quickly, or at least be very severely impaired. And of course, all of this is presupposing one other thing, which is that the seabed is completely flat, which is generally not going to be the case, because, again, let's say we have completely calm water, and let's even say that there isn't really much, if anything, in the way of silt or sand or whatever. So maybe we're going back into Apia Harbour after the big cyclone that stripped away all of that. It's just rock. Now, at that point, you might be thinking, sure, I can steam in. If my draft is 20 feet, calm water, 21-foot depth, I should be fine. Yeah, in theory, except nothing is completely level. So, at that point, you'll probably run into a rock or a slight rise or something like that. So, realistically, you want at least 5-6 feet below your draft level beneath your keel in order to be somewhat safe. And again, as I said, even then, that's for really calm water, not rough weather. In terms of safely navigating shallowish waters, because normally you wouldn't go anywhere close to that shallow water, but if you had to, for whatever reason, obviously later on you'd use depth sounders and sonar to try and see ahead of you what was going on. And most of the time before that time period, you would proceed very slowly. And you'd be taking soundings as you go, and if you have a powered boat or you're going very, very slowly in the age of sail, you might have a boat going ahead of you to take their own soundings to try and warn you of what's coming ahead. The Rogue Chief asks a slightly off-the-wall question, which is how much volume would the P.1000 Ratte need in order to achieve positive buoyancy, essentially becoming an amphibious battleship? Okay, well, first off, the Ratte is supposed to have been a 1,000-ton tank, and I'll just start off by saying that's not going to happen. Certainly if they keep that 11-inch modified Gneisenau turret in any way, shape or form like it was on Gneisenau, because that alone, especially if you account for the machinery you'd need to rotate it, already is going to be pushing the 1,000-ton limit, which would mean everything else would need to be made of aerogel or something. But I mean, most pictures have it with 2 guns instead of 3, and I suppose you don't need the full Gneisenau turret armor thickness to repel tank fire, so let's assume for the sake of argument that the blasted thing is somehow 1,000 tons. But what might surprise you is that in theory, if it somehow was 1,000 tons, at the dimensions it's commonly posited to have been, it would already float. And that's because the hull is supposed to be 35 metres long and 14 metres wide, and it's supposedly 11 metres to the top of the turret. But if we treat the hull as, roughly speaking, a cube, which, let's face it, mostly is, well, a rectangular cube, but nonetheless, 35 by 14 is 490, so that means for every metre of height, it's occupying, roughly speaking, 490 cubic metres. And the reason I'm using a metric is because, obviously, 1 cubic metre of water weighs 1 tonne, so if it displaces a cubic metre of water, it's displacing 1 tonne. So that means that, roughly speaking, for every metre of height of the hull, it's displacing almost half of what it needs to become neutrally buoyant. Now, of course, some parts of the height aren't going to achieve that. The tracks, for obviously reasons, aren't going to displace the full volume of its dimensions. And the 2-3 metre height of the turret and the sort of little turret mounting that you see just underneath it is obviously not occupying the full volume either. And even if we round off a little bit, say down to 400 cubic meters, because obviously it is a slightly irregular shape, then even if the tracks are somehow of neutral density, which they aren't, obviously, but even disregarding the tracks completely, it only needs to submerge itself up to about 2.5 meters of the hull, at which point it's neutrally buoyant, and everything above that is just going to be happily floating away. Now, of course, you are going to have the slightly larger problem that this thing is not really likely to be waterproofed, and that forward gun in the forward hull is definitely probably not going to be waterproof, so the thing's probably going to leak like a sieve and sink very quickly. But in theory, if you packed it full of rubber and sealant and so forth, a Ratte at the posited dimensions and weight would probably float, which is disturbing. Chief Eyeroll asks, following up from the armoured cruiser upgrade question in Drydock 230, for the USS Averof's major refit in France from 25 to 27, were there other modifications considered other than converting to fuel oil firing that were discussed or planned but not implemented? And if cost wasn't an issue, could Averof have been rebuilt or modernised to an extent to be a credible combatant at the start of World War II? I don't believe in her 1920s refit there was anything significant that was discussed for modernising Averof that wasn't actually done, with the exception, as you say, of converting to fuel oil firing. Because, I mean, what else would you do in the 20s? You give her anti-aircraft armament, better fire control systems, and overhaul the machinery, and that was all done. So, in as much as she's still an armoured cruiser, her 1920s upgrade was pretty solid, obviously with the exception of converting to fuel oil firing and leaving her with her old machinery. Now, if we're going with the cost isn't an issue, modernise her right at the start of World War II, well, your main issue is going to be where is that going to happen? Because if it's at the start of World War II, Britain and France's yards aren't going to be able to do it. They're far too busy. The US yards might be able to do it. Well, they would do it if you had unlimited money and you could throw at them. In terms of what you could do for the ship at that point, well, honestly, I don't think the US would sell you radar at that point. Certainly, at that point, Greece is neutral, and it's only when Germany invades into World War II that it becomes a non-neutral party. But you could certainly switch out the machinery. I mean, at that point, switching to oil, fuel, and modern machinery, replacing the old stuff, you'd probably actually get a speed boost out of that. It's tempting to say weld a little bow section on, kind of like how the Italians did to some of their older dreadnought battleships, to try and exploit that extra power for more speed as well, and perhaps do a more comprehensive anti-aircraft update, because only some of the 3-inch guns she was fitted with in the 20s were anti-aircraft capable, so you could strip them all out and replace them with, well, there's a whole ton of 3-inch guns available for anti-aircraft use in the US, so you could stick those on. Perhaps some 20mm Oerlikons as well, but it would be too early for 40mm Bofors and stuff like that. Now, in terms of a reasonable and comprehensive upgrade, I think that would probably be about it. If you were really going all in, though, and you wanted to just throw insane amounts of money at the time, then I suppose in theory you could also take off the secondary wing turrets and, well, since you're in the US, replace them with 5-inch 38s, so maybe put a 5-inch 38 mount in place of each wing turret, and then maybe 2 more 5-inch 38 mounts on that raised section of superstructure between the 2 wing gut turrets there, at which point your light anti-aircraft armament will probably be clustered just behind the funnels and maybe around the bridge superstructure. HMS Islay 10101 asks, when flag signals are used, my understanding is that it goes like this. The command ship raises a signal, which is the message to stand by to execute this order. The receiving ship raises the same signal, which indicates that they've understood and are standing by, and the command ship lowers the signal flags, which order the execution of the order. So my question is, what happens when one or more ships in a formation don't raise the signal? Well, people start to get very angry, but if we're talking about, say, the first half of the 20th century, let's say, World War II, maybe even World War I, some of these may or may not apply depending on the war, but one of the first things that would happen would be a signal lamp being used to flash a signal directly to the recalcitrant ship or ships, because obviously not only would they have missed the flagship raising the signal, they would have missed whichever other ships nearby have raise the acknowledgement signal, which is a spectacular failure in their ability to keep an eye on what's going on. So obviously you signal them by light, basically, hey, look, there's a signal, pay attention, kind of thing. If that doesn't work in World War II, then someone will probably get on the voice radio and basically go, oi, look, are you blind? There's multiple ships that have hoisted the acknowledgement signal, and we've been signaling you by light. Can you please get your act together? And if neither of those work, then you'd go to what they probably would have gone to in the First World War, which would have been to sound off the ship's horn. That's the flagship's horn, which would definitely get somebody's attention, one would hope. But to be honest, if you get to that level of having to sound the ship's horn to get the attention of someone who's missed both the flag raising by multiple ships around them and a signal-by-signal lamp, then unless there's extreme mitigating circumstances, somebody's getting court-martialed afterwards. The Outer Circle asks, the early hydrodynamics pioneers included design cues from several fish. What are some of the most esoteric ideas which have amused you, which people try to use as inspiration in maritime designs? Now, admittedly, I haven't dived into the extensive correspondence of ship designers back in the period where they were just looking around for animals to imitate, although it should be noted that this famous image of an English race-built galleon with fish laid alongside it is part of a series of design documents where the ideal ship was held to have the head of a cod and the tail of a mackerel for ideal hydrodynamic form, mostly because a cod's head, if you've ever seen one, is quite blunt, which also kind of matches the way ships were built at the time, whereas a mackerel's tail is quite slim. And there is a little bit of amusing, earnest correspondence where people are debating exactly which parts of which fish make for the ideal hydrodynamic form for a ship. And then, of course, you have, in the late 19th century, the wonderful Russian ideas to have a near flat-bottomed ship, which you see with the Popovs, the round ships, and also the Livadia, the Russian royal yacht that has a very short lifespan because, that doesn't work out too well. But from an engineering perspective, more generally, when it comes to ship design and design of vehicles in general in that time period, one of the things I do find amusing to a certain degree is the way that people try to justify their decisions, because very often you can see their train of thought, but in terms of how they've selected a thing to imitate, but then it's kind of like they retroactively go back to try and justify it in a thought pattern that's almost a bit like some ancient Greek philosophy. You know, the kind where they're trying to define what something is almost by what it isn't, or saying, well, because it does this thing, it is this, but if it did this other thing, it would be that, with sometimes rather hilarious results as they work their way through. And sometimes you see that, when people say, for example, look at whales and realize, oh, hey, your whale on the surface looks really stable and moves at a reasonable speed and is fairly large. So perhaps if we want a large, stable ship, perhaps we should imitate a whale in form, which, as long as you're not going for real high speed, is not a terrible idea. But then when you see some of the justification, it almost enters a recursive loop of thinking. It's kind of like, we should imitate a whale because the whale, by nature of its grand and majestic form, is stable. And it's like, well, yes, technically that is correct. It is stable because of its form, but there is nothing inherent to being a whale that makes you stable. It's some very key properties of the shape of the whale that makes it both stable and surprisingly fast, usually underwater. Now, of course, without a lot of detailed scientific instrumentation and mathematics, you can't really quantify in the 16th and 17th century exactly why certain forms work in certain ways, other than, again, the recursive, they do, therefore this is the best way. And at least they had the brains to realize, hey, this thing does this thing really well, maybe we should take some lessons from it. But when, obviously, with the benefit of modern technology, we know a bit more about the engineering as to why those animals work that way, it is sometimes funny trying to watch people work out from first principles why these things are the way they are. Andrew Kirschenman asks, would the Deutchlands with 2 quadruple 8-inch turrets have been better for their designed role as compared to how they were actually built? I would say possibly, but it really depends on what element of the Deutschland class's mission that you are looking at. Because obviously it does give you 2 more guns, and in theory you should have a slightly higher rate of fire than the 1111s. And if you're looking at the commerce raiding aspect purely, 8-inch guns are just as good at beating up on merchant ships as 11-inch guns. However, I would have a few concerns. Firstly, with the whole gangster style sideways breech block mechanisms of Krupp guns, I would hate to see the size of a quadruple 8-inch gun made by Krupp. I mean, just look at the size of the doubles or the twins for the Hippers. But that aside, let's assume that you somehow can make one that isn't the size of a small country. My other concern at that point would be that you have invented a ship which has similar levels of firepower, albeit in a slightly different turret arrangement, than other heavy cruisers, at which point you have a heavy cruiser that can go further than other heavy cruisers, but isn't faster than other heavy cruisers, and doesn't possess a significant firepower advantage over other heavy cruisers. Because, a county also has 8 8-inch guns. Algeria has 8 8-inch guns. This thing would have 8 8-inch guns. But those other heavy cruisers can choose how to, fight, because they've got, a 4 or 5, maybe more knot speed advantage, depending on the exact cruiser. So if you are looking at purely, as I said, a kind of long-range commerce raiding cruiser that isn't really going to get involved in much of a fight with anything, except maybe some 6-inch ships, fine. However, there is a certain logic to the 11-inch guns if you're also thinking about potentially running into enemy 8-inch armed heavy cruisers, because at that point the 11-inch does theoretically give you a range advantage. It certainly gives you an advantage at longer ranges when it comes to punching through armor, and in theory obviously also carries a much bigger explosive charge, so can do a lot more damage with a single hit. And compared to a quad 8-inch with the 1111s, you're only losing 2 guns, so you've still got a reasonable broadside. Now, if we look exclusively at the targets the Deutchlands ended up fighting, then I would say broadly speaking, for most of the targets they actually ended up shooting at, the quad 8-inch probably would have been a better bet. However, only something that really, like fighting Exeter at River Plate, would the 11-inch really give you a significant advantage. But they didn't know that at the time. And there was every possibility that French and British heavy cruisers would be all over the place in their war planning. And, at that point, as I said, there is something to be said for the 11-inch. And that's it for this week, everybody. Thank you very much for listening, if indeed you still are, and I hope to see you again in another video soon. Bye for now.